Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor and I'm a Sony Digital Imaging Ambassador. But today it's not about the cameras or lenses, it's about our post-production editing software. Now, I'm a long-time Lightroom user, in fact from the very beginning, but I have been looking at other software. A few years ago I looked at Capture One, and now I've been looking at DxO PhotoLab. We're up to version 8 of this software. Now, it's been winning a lot of awards. In fact, for the last 5 years it's taken out the TIPA awards for the best software. So if you haven't taken a look at this, maybe this video will give you a bit of interest in this as an alternative product. Now, for many photographers, it's an attractive product because you don't have to lease the product, you can buy the product outright. But it's still a daunting prospect to think about changing from maybe Lightroom to PhotoLab is maybe a step too far for many people. It'd be like me thinking about changing from my Sony cameras, where I know the menus inside out and backwards, to thinking about moving to Canon or Nikon, where I'd have to learn all of their menus from scratch. So this video is about a pain-free transition from Lightroom to DxO PhotoLab if you're ready to make that move. So without much further ado, let's take a deeper dive into this software and see what is going on for the software to win all of these awards. And welcome to my review of DxO PhotoLab 8. Now, when I recently surveyed my patrons on patreon.com, 79% of them are currently using Lightroom to organize their files, and obviously that flows through to editing. Now, some of those are using Lightroom Classic, some of them are using Lightroom the cloud version, and some people are adding in software to the Lightroom in order to do some further editing, such as from companies by Topaz or DxO. Now, when I did this survey, I did miss out Affinity Photo, but Affinity Photo is more of a direct competitor with Adobe's Photoshop. That's sophisticated image editing using layers, but not necessarily any cataloging link to that. Now, it appears that 20% of my patrons are using one of these 4 alternatives to Lightroom to catalog their files. These are On One, Capture One, Luminar Neo and DxO PhotoLab. Now, I was very keen to work with DxO PhotoLab. I have been using this as a plugin for my Lightroom for some very sophisticated noise reduction, and also more recently for some Lens Softness Compensations, which are amazing. PhotoLab has been awarded Best Imaging Software by TIPA for 5 years in a row. That's the Technical Image Press Association. So when DxO reached out to me and said, would you like to do a sort of a transition video to help my patrons move from Lightroom perhaps over to DxO PhotoLab as an alternative, then I was quite keen to do this. Now, as I said, it has been awarded the TIPA award now for Best Imaging Software for 5 years in a row. A total of 10 times actually, but 5 years in a row for the last 5 years. So I'm making this movie not to try and sell PhotoLab as an alternative to Lightroom, but also trying to help my patrons make the transition or the move from Lightroom to DxO PhotoLab. So this is a video that's designed to make that move as pain-free as possible. Cloud syncing is not part of DxO PhotoLab, so I do have to point that out from the start. Now, not everybody is using that cloud syncing facility of Lightroom or the Lightroom cloud version, so this may not be an issue for many people wanting to make that transition. Now, one of the big questions that I really need to address, because a lot of people actually don't consider this when they're thinking about moving, is what happens to my Lightroom catalog when I stop paying the subscription? And so this description is basically outlining and mapping out that you don't lose your catalog entirely. The software will continue to open even though you've stopped paying your subscription fee. So when you cancel your Adobe subscription to Lightroom, you can still open and use the catalog, but not the develop and map modules. That does require the paid subscription to be maintained. You can still use the library module to organize, export and print your photos, and your edits will still be visible. You can also export your raw photos as JPEG or TIFF files, so the Lightroom edits can be viewed by your new editing application. This is an important part of the transition, so you don't really have to be too worried about ending that subscription, because that Lightroom catalog is still going to be a working catalog for you. One of the reasons that you may want to export your raw files as edited TIFFs or JPEGs is when you point DxO PhotoLab at those folders containing those files, you won't be able to see your raw edits. You will be able to see the raw edits if you've basically exported them as TIFFs or JPEGs, but the raw files themselves, the previews will revert to the unedited versions. If you are making or considering making that decision about maybe transitioning to DxO or any other editing service that doesn't require a subscription, I do think it's also important to talk about money. So what I've done here is I've given you a comparison between DxO and Lightroom. So what we've got is a 3-year period with the initial purchase plus one upgrade during that 3-year period. Adobe often refer to people who don't upgrade every time, this was prior to their cloud subscription service, as version skippers, because sometimes you don't need to upgrade every year just to access one or two new features. So we can compare a $408 price for somebody who has version skipped DxO PhotoLab compared to Adobe with that 3 years subscription. And that 3 years subscription is for their cloud Lightroom, not the full version of Classic with the other software involved. So DxO basically is only cheaper if you don't upgrade your software more than once in a 3-year period. So obviously the alternative to the Lightroom, the cloud version, is the photography plan with 1 terabyte worth of cloud storage. Now with that version, you're basically getting 5 pieces of software: Photoshop, Adobe Lightroom Classic, Adobe Lightroom, the cloud version. You get Photoshop on your iPad, and Bridge. Bridge is actually a free piece of software for anybody. You don't actually have to pay for the photography plan in order to be able to download Bridge. DxO 3-year period with all upgrades plus an additional piece of DxO software called Film Pack will actually cost you a little bit more than the cloud subscription over that 3-year period. And I'll basically outline why that Film Pack may be something that you will consider adding if you take out or purchase DxO PhotoLab 8. So why bundle DxO PhotoLab? And that is because you unlock some features inside of PhotoLab by basically purchasing the Film Pack 7. And these are luminosity masks and also creative vignetting. Now I will be showing you how to basically circumnavigate the creative vignetting in this tutorial, so don't rush out and buy Film Pack until you've watched this video in its entirety. Now the luminosity masks, again, some people using Lightroom Classic or Lightroom the cloud version will not have used the luminance range masks that Adobe provide. So I'm outlining here where I'm using a luminance range, and it's just select the brightest highlights on the wings, and then I can maybe put a little bit of a lower exposure or drag the white slider to the left slightly in order to force a little bit more detail into those brightest areas of the image. Again, a lot of people haven't used this facility, so that shouldn't be a reason why you should rush out and buy the Film Pack. Now Film Pack is an interesting piece of software in that it can emulate historical film emulsions, analog films. Here I'm emulating Fuji Neopan 400, which was a film emulsion that I used before I basically converted and transitioned fully to digital photography. So this is an interesting piece of software, and you can also add some paper or grunge or film border edges to your output files there. But it does also unlock a couple of the features that some people will want to use in the PhotoLab 8. And one of those is creative vignetting. PhotoLab does some corrective vignetting for lens distortions where edges of images are a little bit lighter than the center. It does those corrections and very good corrections as well. But if you want to actually darken the edges of your frame creatively, basically creative vignetting, then you can do that using the DxO film pack, because that does give you access to a few more panels. And as I said, I will be showing you a workaround for this feature. DxO also offer bundling PhotoLab with Nik Collection. This is a range of multiple different pieces of software that do all sorts of different things. Now, I'm less inclined to recommend that people purchase this. I would probably recommend that they purchase the film pack first instead of this. It's slightly cheaper and it does give you access to a few interesting effects. Now, the Nik effects, they do emulate film, they do create grunge looks, which I can show here. This is a bleached portrait look using the Nik Collection Color FX Pro. For people who are not interested in this stylized type of photography, then you could perhaps just ignore that Nik Collection. But as I said, that film pack does give you access to a couple of features that I would use on a regular basis. So here is Nik Collection Analog FX Pro. Remember, the film pack does give you the ability to emulate film emulsions with creative edges. So there is a little bit of an overlap between Analog FX Pro and the film pack software there. Perhaps one of the more interesting ones from the Nik Collection is the Silver FX Pro, giving you quite a lot of control about how you emulate your black and white conversions to look like film emulsions. Now, one of the things that I've seen other reviewers of DxO PhotoLab make a song and dance about is the fact that you can edit images without importing them in DxO PhotoLab. So I did want to outline that this isn't exclusive to DxO PhotoLab, because Bridge is a cataloging piece of software. You don't really need to import images for Bridge to catalog them, and it is a free piece of software. If you go to Adobe's website, you can download this and Adobe will not charge you for using this cataloging service. One of the other things about Lightroom is the cloud version also allows you to edit local files without importing them as well. And if you do navigate to a folder on your desktop or in your pictures folder and then start editing it, when you've decided that really you do want it in your catalog and it does need to be backed up on the cloud that supports that, then you do have the option of just clicking on the button which says copy photo to the cloud, and then that becomes part of your cloud catalog backed up online. Okay, so let's go deeper into DxO PhotoLab. I've looked at some of the things that the cloud syncing that DxO PhotoLab doesn't support, but if you're still interested in this, then let's dive deeper. Now, I've put in some advantages and disadvantages, and the disadvantages does look like a longer list, but many of these disadvantages basically don't apply to a lot of photographers because they just don't use these type of file formats or these services in their existing Lightroom cataloging service. So let's take a look at the advantages first. We've got class-leading denoising algorithms. Now, their Pure Raw 4 at the time of making this video was doing a better job of denoising than the denoising feature inside of Lightroom. Now, there may be a little bit of a battle between the software companies about who is doing the better denoising, but at the time of making this video, the award really belongs to DxO in this area. So their software engineers really know their stuff in this area. We've got a very interesting feature that I've also been using, which is called Lens Softness Compensation. Now, this is achieving astonishing levels of sharpness, and it's a very intelligent piece of sharpening because it understands your lens through the profiles and will only sharpen where it needs to sharpen and will increase the sharpening maybe at the edges to match the center. So as I said, it's a very sophisticated bit of sharpening that I will show you how good it is as we go through this tutorial. It's got cutting edge camera and lens profiles. So DxO are not just content to test a lens or a camera, they test the lenses on the cameras at different zoom levels, and you're getting some class leading profiles there. It's also a one-off purchase, no subscriptions, but you will pay for upgrades. If DxO create new features that you want to acquire, you may have to pay for that via a paid upgrade. Let's take a look at some of the disadvantages. Now, one of the threats to the JPEG as a file format is the HEIF or HEIC. Sony calls this the HIF, the HIF files. These are not yet supported by DxO PhotoLab. I expect them to be supported at some time in the future, but they're not currently supported at the moment. PhotoLab also doesn't support enhanced DNG files. This is raw files which you've used super resolution, you've grown the resolution inside of Lightroom, or you've applied the Adobe denoise. So this is not a problem moving forward because you won't be using these if you're making that transition. Also, if you've been using Sony's small RAW or medium RAW file formats, these are also not supported. Now, I've only ever used small RAW or medium RAW when I'm doing time-lapse footage, and I really don't need my high resolution because the output is going to be a video or movie, not stills. So this really doesn't impact me a great deal because I don't do a lot of time-lapse. DxO doesn't support Adobe Photoshop files. It does support TIFF files, but not Photoshop files. That's the .psd. That's no biggie if you've not been using Photoshop, or you're more than happy just to work with TIFF files. Some of the downsides about DxO PhotoLab for some Lightroom users, especially those using the AI masking tools. These are the tools where we can select subject, select sky, select background, select a person, select the skin of a person. Then we don't have these AI tools yet inside of DxO PhotoLab. I'm sure the guys at DxO are probably working on these. So if you are editing and you do want to maybe just darken the background quickly, this will be a longer workflow at the moment inside of DxO. Other things that are not supported is if you've been using photo merge, such as creating panoramas or doing HDR or focus stitching inside of Adobe software, then these files are not fully supported when you're going to open them in DxO PhotoLab. Perhaps the biggest disadvantage, and this video is going to basically show you how to navigate this in a pain-free way, is the editing workflows of any piece of software, not just DxO, is going to be different than Lightroom. So it does require different tools, different shortcuts, and different workflows to achieve the same results that you've been achieving inside of Lightroom. So there is a little bit of a learning curve, and it can be a little bit steep at the beginning, and the purpose of this video is to make that much less steep if you are making that transition. So one of the questions that some people I've seen on the DxO forums ask is, okay, so I've got a new camera and I'm having to wait before I can edit the raw files from this camera. And one of the reasons for that is because, as I said, the profiles for the cameras, the profiles for the lenses, the profiles for specific lenses on specific cameras do take a little extra time for DxO to make all of those very sophisticated profiles. So they've got a statement on their DxO website which says the team in charge of cameras and lenses needs to shoot up to 1,000 test images for the purposes of measurement and calibration, which can take extra time since only commercially available models are used for this purpose. Even after this process, it takes time to produce profiles and integrate them into our software. So basically, if you've just purchased a brand new camera that's basically a new release for Sony, you might find yourself waiting for a month before you can actually open these raw files in your DxO software. So is the change worth the effort? And because this video extends from beyond this point, I think the change is definitely worth considering. Now, it isn't going to be better for everyone, but it is going to be attractive to many people who are looking at alternatives to Lightroom. So let's take to why you may want to make that change. First off, and the first thing that I was really attracted to using DxO before DxO reached out to me about making this was I was very aware of Deep Prime. I joined this with Deep Prime 2. It's basically got even better since I made that video, and a lot of people were astonished with the results I was getting out of DxO Pure Raw 2 at that time. So we're now up to XD/XD2S algorithms here. This is a lizard that I basically photographed at ISO 8000 in a very dark rainforest. I simply couldn't push the shutter speed any slower, so I was really forced to accept that ISO 8000. Now, inside of PhotoLab, I've basically pointed the loop at this because the pure raw algorithms are inside of PhotoLab 8. So if you don't need to buy pure raw as a separate piece of software. If you're buying PhotoLab 8, you're going to get this cutting edge technology inside of PhotoLab. Now, in order to see what I'm going to get, and when I process this file, we've got this loop feature. So I click on the loop, I move it over an area of the image, and then I go, wow, where did that noise go? Not only is the noise vanished, it's basically looking a lot sharper as well. And that is basically the Lens Softness Compensation also working with the DxO Denoising Technologies. And once you're happy with that, then you just hit the process and basically bake in those changes into your raw file. Let's take a look at some other basically astonishing results. This is using an A6000 APS-C camera. Now, most people know that the problems of using an APS-C camera is higher levels of noise, less dynamic range, and when we get up to ISO values of 6400 on an APS-C camera, many people thought the files were basically just unusable. So here we are zooming in to 100% and showing that the image just doesn't look very sharp, and also quite a lot of noise. We roll the loop over that image and already the image looks a hell of a lot sharper, and also the noise is seemingly vanished. And so that now looks like, for my eyes, looks like it was captured with a full frame camera at lower ISO. So again, we do have to export that as a JPEG or a raw file, DNG file, to bake in the noise reduction and also those lens softness compensations, which I'll refer to just as the sharpening process. Once you've been working with these lens softness compensations, you are sort of attracted to go back into your catalog from maybe 10 years ago and start looking at 10-year-old lenses and just seeing how sharp those images can appear to be now once you roll out these new technologies. So on this slide, I've got the unsharpened image on the left and the sharpened image on the right, just using lens softness compensation, no other sharpening applied. And I'd have to say my aging 55mm 1.8 lens now looks like it's a G Master lens. It is really quite noticeable, and sometimes you don't really need to zoom into 100% to see this. You can clearly see that you've got a much sharper image even at 50% magnification. One of the things that if you're accessing these technologies, if you notice the lens softness compensation can't be selected, it's grayed out basically, nothing to click. Just make sure that the profiles have been downloaded. In the browser, that's basically the grid view, you'll see a little icon in the bottom right hand corner, which is the camera with the magnifying glass. If you click on that, you will be invited to download a profile. Sometimes you might be quizzed as to which lens were you actually using on this particular camera, because I've got a choice of two profiles here. So this was actually Zeiss Batis 85mm 1.8 on a Sony Alpha 7S II. So I just select that basically, and then the profile will be downloaded to my computer. Things to be aware of when migrating from Lightroom Classic. Now basically there's no map, no book, no slideshow, and no web modules. Now, I have to say, I think the vast majority of Lightroom users, classic users, are basically not using those modules. So this is no biggie for many people, I think. If you are using all of those modules, then you are going to have to rethink. And maybe if you just want access to that lens softness compensation or the noise reduction technologies, then purchasing pure RAW instead of PhotoLab may be your better option there. So let's just recap there. No support for enhanced DNG files. Basically, I've already run noise reduction inside of this raw file in my Lightroom catalog, so I can't open and start editing this file in PhotoLab. I have to go back and look for the unprocessed raw file. No support for SRAW, MRAW, and as I said again, most people are not using those file formats either, so that's no biggie either. And again, I'll probably ask DxO whether they would consider supporting these raw file formats, so let's take a look. And I do have a dialogue going now with DxO, which is great. So here's partial support for Adobe's Photo Merge. So this is where I've merged 3 vertical exposures into a single panoramic image. Now you'll see that it's not done the correction around the edges, which was done by Lightroom. So I'm not seeing that when I open the image inside of PhotoLab. So again, I'd probably just have to crop a bit tighter and then edit from scratch. I can use that panoramic stitch, but just not all of the features of that edited image. If you do purchase DxO PhotoLab 8, you can actually open images from your Lightroom catalog. You would just go to File, Plug-in Extras, Transfer to DxO PhotoLab 8. I have been working with Pure RAW in the past, and that is quite a simple workflow, and that does work quite well. Just go again to Plugin Extras, Preview and Process with DxO Pure RAW, or if I've already set up my processing in Pure RAW and I'm happy with those settings for the vast majority of my images, I can just, as an alternative, just choose Process Instantly with DxO Pure RAW 4, and then that file automatically comes back into my Lightroom catalog. Okay, so you're not deterred, you do want to carry on, so let's do it. So if you've downloaded DxO PhotoLab, you can obviously just jump in and make the purchase. Look for my purchase code below, you will get a discount. And if you open up DxO PhotoLab for the first time, you'll be presented with a splash screen that you may never see again. And it's basically giving you some choices about how you want DxO to handle your files. Now the top one sounds very attractive, and it does say ideal for most photographers, DxO style natural. Do not select this if you're a raw shooter. I would just choose the second one down, which is optical corrections only, because I'm going to treat you as a demanding photographer, and this gives you a lot more control about when you first see the files. So you've selected that one as your new default. Then you probably want to go to Settings General for DxO. You can see that's already that default is selected there for raw images. Number 3, DxO Optical Corrections Only. RGB images, which are your JPEG images, you want no correction. These files have already been processed, and you really don't want to invite DxO to process them again, and because the images will look different to how you last saw them after exporting them from Lightroom. For instance, I pointed DxO PhotoLab at a folder of exported JPEGs, and if I've got the style natural selected, it said ideal for most photographers, but you can see this is less than ideal, is because now all of these files don't look natural, they look unnatural, and that's because DxO has reprocessed them a second time. We get too much contrast, we get too much color saturation. Now, if you've forgotten to do the first step and you're watching this movie after you've already downloaded and starting using DxO PhotoLab, then just select all of the images in that browser view, what Lightroom would call the grid view, and just go Image, Apply Preset, No Correction. And this will remove all of those corrections that DxO was applying to your already processed images. There's basically two areas that we work in with DxO PhotoLab. That's the PhotoLibrary, grid and loop view alternative to Lightroom. And then we've got the Customize tab there, which is basically your develop module. Now, I'm just pointing out with that little big silver ball there is a little bit of a dot. Now, if you drag up and down, you're going to see either the browser view with the grid or the loop view. If you drag the browser, the grid view, all of the way to the bottom to see the enlarged image of one of your files in the browser, then you cannot then use the keyboard shortcut to return to the grid view. You do have to double click or drag that little silver ball up or down. That is just a word of warning you might be hunting around, and that's just one of the slight workflow differences that you will encounter. Once you know that, then you won't unforget that. And you'll probably learn the keyboard shortcut, which is Shift Tab to display hide image browser. If you've used that keyboard shortcut and you're still looking at one image, not your grid of images, then just remember to double click on that little silver dot or drag up to see that grid or browser view. We do have options for collections, which are you used to probably creating in Lightroom Classic. These are called projects in DxO PhotoLab, and you can pretty much manage them as you did your collections. You can select a bunch of images and then make a project. You can drag images into that project once you've already made a project to build on that initial project, and you can right click on images and then add them to a named project. So pretty much the same as your Lightroom workflow, except they're called projects and not collections. You may want to screen grab this screen here. You can find these keyboard shortcuts in PhotoLab, but you probably want these keyboard shortcuts on a sticky note for the first week or two until you learn them. Now, there are some single letter keyboard shortcuts inside of Lightroom that I'm used to using, like G for grid, D for develop, E for loop, and F for full screen. These are three keyboard shortcuts in DxO PhotoLab, so that's probably why you want them on a sticky note. Like that library view on my Mac is Command Option 1, and then Customize view, which is the develop view, is the Command Option 2. And then we've got the Shift tab for that display hide image browser, and then for full screen we've got Shift Command F on my Mac. That command would be Control on a PC. So there are some quite long keyboard shortcuts in DxO, and I would perhaps like or appreciate the ability to maybe shorten some of these. So I'm used to copying my develop settings and then pasting them to multiple other images or just the next image in my browser. That would be called copy correction settings in DxO PhotoLab and paste correction settings. Now these are available from the image menu and not the edit menu inside of DxO PhotoLab, and they are 4-key keyboard shortcuts. So in order to do that, I'm holding down the command key, the shift key, the option key, and then C for copy, and then the same keys, and then the V key in order to paste those correction settings. Also, if you've got lots of keyboard shortcuts, then you're obviously going to get a second sticky note because your local adjustments will also have different keyboard shortcuts. So for instance, I sometimes paint in localized adjustments, and I would just tap in K to access the brush in Lightroom Classic. That would be Shift plus B inside of a DxO PhotoLab. Linear gradients are called graduated filters in PhotoLab, and radial gradients, there's no direct alternative in PhotoLab, but the nearest one is called control point, and I'll talk about that as we move forward, because the control points is a very interesting point of difference between Lightroom and PhotoLab. One of the interesting things about PhotoLab is you can customize your develop or customize workflow there. So I'm going to actually basically show you how to do that, because I won't work with one of the defaults. I would prefer to customize. And one of the reasons I'm customizing this is to get it actually closer to the way you're used to working inside of Lightroom. So again, it's less of a difference and it's closer to what you've already experienced using. Now remember that little silver dot? That would be used to access your what Lightroom calls the film strip. And you can drag that out of the way once you've accessed another image. You don't have to go back to your photo library to get another image. You can just drag up to access that film strip, still called the browser here. Now there's no keyboard shortcuts for this. You will be dragging up and down or double clicking on that silver dot. We're actually in Lightroom now, so I'm just showing you that you're used to working with this particular layout where you have the histogram at the top, some localized adjustment tools below, and then the basic panel below. So I'm going to highlight 5 areas of difference here. The histogram, number 1, the profile, that might be the Adobe profile or your camera profile. We've got the white slider in the basic, just above the black slider. We've got something that Adobe calls presence. You're probably more used to it being the clarity, the dehaze and texture sliders. And we've got the saturation, which is vibrance and saturation. These tools are not in their obvious location inside of DxO PhotoLab, so we're going to basically put them somewhere where we can get quick access to them. By default, DxO PhotoLab have 2 choices of workspace, standard or advanced. If you work with the standard, you'll be going up to the box above the basic tools because the editing can be divided up to 6 different areas. I personally find this a little bit confusing, going backwards and forwards between 6 different layouts of editing. So I just basically like to grab everything and put it in or just above my basic tools. The other alternative is advanced, and that's the everything. And the problem with advanced is you might only use half the tools, so that can look a little bit crowded and everything just gets a little bit smaller and you're scrolling a little bit more. So I'm going to work with DxO standard and then just add a few more things in that I'm used to working with on a daily basis. First thing is we do have the navigator, what Adobe called a navigator. It's called Move Zoom window. This is quite a useful feature if you've zoomed in and then you're just trying to move to a different area of the image to carry on editing. And we also have the histogram on the left in DxO PhotoLab, not above the basics on the right. That's not an issue, however, because we can simply click and drag that out of the left side and put it in above the basics on the right side. And so that can live where you're used to seeing the histogram if you want as fewer changes as possible. So as you can see, that histogram now takes a pride of place above my basic panels. So if you want to save a workspace, a modified workspace at any time, then you simply come up to Workspaces in the main menus at the top and do Save Workspace. Just give it a name. This could be Advanced plus Histogram, for instance. Let's make a custom workspace, however, from the basic panel here. So we'll work with the DxO standard, which I'm calling the basic, and we're going to now modify this into a new workspace here. So as I said, that histogram is being moved over to the right. Even the histogram looks a little bit different to the histogram that you may be used to seeing inside of Lightroom. So we're used to little triangles just above the histogram on the left and right sides for the clipping warnings. That's where it shows you when your shadows have got no information left in them, they're absolutely solid black, or where your highlights no longer have any detail because they're overexposed. If you want to see that, you would basically click on that little moon for shadows clipping and the sun for highlight clipping. We've also got up the top there, we've got monitor and destination gamut warnings. Now that monitor warning will show you colors that might be too saturated to display accurately on your monitor, because it is reading the monitor profile that you've got working at any one time. You'll also notice that RGB histogram is selected, and so you can just look at the red, green, blue or luminance values only if that is your preferred way. So I'm now looking at the destination gamut warning. Now this is grayed out most of the time. You do have to activate the soft proofing workflow in the soft proofing panel in order to be able to actually click on that one. So one of the things that you may want to do is actually just access the soft proofing panel from the drop down menu of the basics panel or the histogram panel and then slide that in as a new panel just below the histogram, or if you prefer, just inside of the basic tools. So that means that as soon as you click on soft proofing, you can actually click on that destination gamut warning. This requires that you put in a printer profile in order to work out whether those colors will be slightly problematic for the destination space using that printer, that paper, those inks, etc. So in this instance, I've just managed those out of gamut colors, the colors that are to saturation for my destination space, and I've just lowered the saturation of just the blues so they go back into gamut and they will print with full detail when I'm printing. Let's just add some more things to this layout that I'm customizing here. So in the basic tools, I'm clicking on that drop down menu to access some additional panels that I'm going to add to the basics panel here. One of those is profile. Now inside of Lightroom, the first thing that Adobe usually invites you to do is select a profile. So in here I've actually selected a custom profile that I made for my Alpha 7R2. If I wanted access in DxO PhotoLabs, from that drop-down menu, I'd just look for color, black and white rendering, which will give me access to the profiles. Now the white slider is interesting because it's actually missing from the DxO PhotoLab basics. We have a black slider, but not a white slider. In order to set a white point for our images, we have to do this via the tone curve. And as I said, this tutorial is really designed to make this transition as pain-free as possible. So if you were looking for the white slider, hopefully this video tutorial is basically showing you a workflow where you will be accessing your whites as you would expect. Let's go back to the profiles. You'll see that DxO gives me the choice of using a DxO camera profile that DxO made. Now remember, these profiles do tend to be better than the ones Adobe are using, which is a one-size-fits-all profile. But here in this particular panel, I'm accessing an ICC profile that I created, and I can actually pick that up as an alternative to the DxO profile there. You can actually make your unique profiles. You can't make dual illuminant profiles as far as I'm aware at the moment, but you can make a specific profile, which is probably highly suited to maybe a studio workflow on a specific day. So you basically just use that calibrated color profile option in order to profile from your Calibrite color checker, and this will create a very specific profile for that working environment. One of the things that you can't currently do inside of DxO is there are some camera matching profiles in Lightroom that sort of emulate the profiles that you might see in the creative styles inside of your late model alpha camera. So you can actually change that inside of Lightroom, but not so inside of DxO PhotoLabs. Moving back to the whites, remember we've got highlights, midtones, shadows, blacks, but we don't have that white slider, so you'll basically set the white point using the right side of the tone curve. You'll look for that little triangle, and if there is no white point currently set, then you'll drag that to the left. Here's a different image. There was no white point. This was quite a low contrast image, so I'm setting a white point by dragging that to the left. When you want to know when you've set the brightest possible white tone before clipping, remember return to the histogram and click on that show highlight clipping warning, which is that little sun icon there. There are a couple of other differences inside of DxO PhotoLab. For instance, the Dehaze is called Clear View Plus, and that exists in a separate panel. We've also got an equivalent to clarity, which is called micro contrast. So these are ways of just increasing localized contrast or effectively punching much more contrast back in to something that was very low in contrast because maybe you'd shot it through a plain window or it was a foggy day and you're just trying to put in a lot more contrast that was absent from that raw file. Now, if we're looking for saturation and vibrancy, it exists in the HSL panel. So you do want to make sure that is living inside of your basics, because it's not going to live in alongside your tone, your blacks and shadows, highlights. It is going to be accessed from that separate HSL panel there. Before I've saved this modified standard workspace, I've basically added in some other tools here: chromatic aberration, crop, DxO denoising, lens softness compensation, and unsharp mask. I could have accessed those from the little icons above the histogram, but I really don't want to be going backwards and forwards. I just want to scroll down and access them from this modified standard workspace. And so I'll save that as a new workspace, such as I'll just give it my initials or a modified standard. Now, and one more point, it's a very subtle difference, but occasionally if you've been editing and you go, actually, I'm just making a dog's dinner of this, I'll just reset. You're not going to find it in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. You're going to find it right up there on the top right side of your screen. Occasionally I found that to be grayed out, in which case you'd just go to the image and you'd apply no corrections and then go back to the absolute starting point for that image, or maybe the starting point with the lens corrections applied. Now here I am with the crop. You can access crop from the top tools or from your crop panel that you may have added to your basics there. Here I'm editing in 16:9. Now it is possible, it's more easy inside of DxO PhotoLab to include some non-image area, which is the background behind, or the area outside of the image pixels, especially if you've been rotating the image or applying some transform corrections. By going into the crop panel and just selecting auto, it will correct that, but again you might have to reshuffle that into place for the perfect framing there. Here I've gone in and selected correction auto. It's got rid of the black area outside of the image area, but I might need to drag that crop area just to perfect the composition there. Adobe's light sliders in the basic panel rarely create problems when editing, even with maximum adjustments. Sometimes with very high contrast images, I'll use maximum shadows, minimum highlights adjustments, and add in contrast as well. And I can often get away and the image looks perfectly acceptable. And I'm going to showcase that if you do that in the selective tone, where you do have highlights, midtones, shadows, and blacks, you tend not to be able to get away with that without the image looking a little bit strange or over processed. So in order to avoid that over processed look, you will be using selective tone, but you'll probably almost certainly be using the tone curve panel as well. Just to highlight this, here we are inside of Adobe Lightroom Classic. This is an instance where I have used minimum highlights, maximum shadows adjustment, and the image looks okay. It looks like the shadows aren't too dark and the highlights aren't too bright. If I was trying to replicate that using only the selective tone panel, we're going to get that over processed tone mapped or faux HDR look, and so we're not going to do this only in selective tone. We're going to use much gentler adjustments and then finish that up in the tone curve. Here's another example. This time I'm only using -80, +80 on those two sliders. And again, if I try and use very aggressive adjustments on the highlights and shadows, I am going to get that over processed look again. So you can get there, you can emulate what you've been doing in Lightroom, but you'll do it by using selective tone, tone curve. You might use one of the other panels such as smart lighting, which is also an automated way of correcting an image that's got too much contrast, but you'll certainly be using the tone curve and probably the selective tone panels. Here I'm matching what I was able to do inside of Lightroom, but it is a mixture between selective tone and tone curve as well. Because you are going to be using tone curve and you may not have used the tone curve much in Lightroom, I do need to highlight what exactly is happening in the tone curve panel, given that you'll be using it if you transition over to DxO PhotoLab. So we do have some presets right there at the top. Here I've added a tone curve with medium contrast added to the raw file, and I've just selected that as a preset, and you'll see that it's put on 3 little points on that curve, and we've got this gentle S-curve adding contrast to that file. Now, I do recommend that if you're only editing tone, not color, I would select L for the luminance rather than RGB. This makes sure that your colors don't drop in saturation or increase in saturation when you add or decrease contrast. Highlights are up there at the top of the tone curve, midtones in the middle, shadows down the bottom, and by pulling up on each one of those little pins or anchor points you can make shadows darker or lighter, midtones darker or lighter, or highlights darker or lighter just by moving on those. Now you do have blacks and whites. We have a black slider in another panel, but this is where you're editing the whites because we don't have a white slider in those tonal adjustments. This tone picker means that if you're not too sure whether it's a midtone or shadow you're trying to edit, you can click directly inside of the image and pull up or down. It will add the anchor point to your tone curve and then make that darker or lighter. Sharpen. This is an interesting point of difference between Lightroom and DxO. First off, I started searching for sharpness and it came back with no matching corrections, because I seem to have to know that sometimes sharpening is referred to by its historical name as the unsharp mask, which you'll find in programs such as Photoshop. But unless you search for unsharp mask, you're not going to find sharpening. A little bit weird. I would like DxO to, if you're close enough, even maybe with a slight spelling error, it comes up with some results rather than no results. Notice the default is set to 0.50 radius. The default inside of Lightroom would be 1.00. I searched for sharpness when I was in the basic adjustments and it came up with nothing to be found. But actually sharpness is a word that DxO used, but just in the local adjustments only, i.e. we can selectively apply sharpness just to one area of the image. Now you will notice in the sharpness panel, if you've added that to the basics as a local adjustment, it does have a little eye with a line through, basically saying that you can't actually, if you might drag up the intensity, the amount of sharpening, but you're not going to see that in the fit in screen view. You do have to zoom into 75% or more in actually to see the increase in sharpness that you're applying to that image. There is an indicator on the panel with that eye with the line through going warning. When you're making adjustments with this particular control, you do have to use the loop view. You drag that over an area that you're editing, or zoom in to 75% or larger. Now, if you are used to going into what's called threshold view when applying masking to your sharpening, so we're only sharpening the edges, you'd hold down the Alt Option key as you drag the masking slider to the right, and when you can only see the outline of the main subjects, that is where sharpening is being restricted to. We generally want to avoid sharpening the smooth areas of continuous tone because it just makes the noise more prominent and we don't need the noise to be sharper than it already is. Now there is no threshold view of DxO. Well, not that I could find. Maybe it is there. So what I did is I used the loop view, and what I did is I dragged the intensity and radius sliders up to maximum setting, which creates quite an ugly look to the sharpening, I have to say. This is a temporary adjustment. It just allows me to find the optimum point for threshold. Basically, when the smooth areas of continuous tone are not ugly, then sharpening is not occurring in those areas. And then I can drop the intensity and radius back to their default values. There is, however, a much more sophisticated way of sharpening your images, and this is that Lens Softness Compensation. Now, again, we do have to have the profile downloaded, but if it is, then you'll be able to click on that little button on the panel to activate the Lens Softness Compensation. The default values are great. You do have some control over details and bokeh as well, but the default values are really excellent. Just a reminder, this is one of those features
features that is also shared, where you can't really see what you're doing unless you've zoomed in to 75% or 100% or greater, or you're using that loop view. So that loop will become probably your friend. I always use the larger loop size and then just drag that over area of the image, and you can see how much increase in sharpening you're getting by applying this adjustment. And here's a side-by-side view. I'm using the compare feature inside of DxO PhotoLab, and I can see a before and after. And as I said, some old non-G master lenses, not even a G lens in this instance, and they do look absolutely fabulous once this lens softness compensation has been applied to much cheaper lenses and much older lenses. So if you're using the denoising, then I would recommend the Deep Prime XD2S as well. But in this particular slide, I'm just highlighting the fact that if lens softness compensation is grayed out, then it is an invitation just to make sure that you've downloaded the profile for this compensation. Chromatic aberrations is also something else that is not visible at magnifications lower than 75%. You will want to zoom in or use that loop. So showing you these chromatic aberrations, this is the red fringing and the green fringing that you can see now. Those will be visible at the smaller magnifications. Those are a little bit, you've just noticed them, and you put the loop in or you zoom in, those will be removed if chromatic aberrations is enabled, and that is something that DxO does remarkably well because it has excellent camera profiles. As you can see here, moving in, not a hint of any of that color fringing because the lens profile is excellent. Only problem with this is if you go into the full screen viewer, because you're at a magnification lower than 75%, you will notice the color fringing hasn't been removed. You will really need to process and output that image and then view that full screen in order to see your full screen view without chromatic aberrations. Or just zoom in to 75% because they'll be gone then. One of the common tasks, especially for landscape shooters when we stop the aperture down, is being able to remove some of the dust spots from our sensors. Now this is a particularly bad example, and you can see there's quite a few spots to remove. Now some of them are quite subtle, and so this is something that you will have to zoom in and scan around looking for any minor blemishes rather than just the major ones. Now there is a helping hand inside of Adobe software where we can check the box called Visualize Spots. Again, this puts the image into threshold view, which we don't have in DxO PhotoLabs, and this helps you locate those dust spots perhaps a little bit more easily, especially for the more subtle ones there. Now we talked about vignette or vignetting, and we worked out that it is vignetting, not vignette, and so you might get a negative search if you're looking for that particular tool. But if you've added it already to your basic panel and then saved your workspace, you'll be able to come to this. Now vignetting is a corrective vignetting inside of DxO PhotoLabs. So generally you won't be coming here because as soon as you've automated the optical corrections inside of DxO Photo, you won't see any lighter corners or edges, such as the ones that I'm showing you in this slide now, where it hasn't yet been applied. You will basically do that correction auto, and then you won't be seeing any of these lighter corners. I've just gone in and switched it to manual so you can see those lighter corners, but I can't actually do a darkening of the corners, which is what something DxO PhotoLabs call creative vignetting. So in order to do creative vignetting, if you haven't bought the Film Pack 7 to free up that creative vignetting, you can just use a control point and then invert the control point, drag the chroma and luma sliders to 0, and then lower the exposure, which will darken the edges of the frame. Creative vignetting, if you've got the DxO Film Pack, is a lot faster as it is in Lightroom. You just simply drag the intensity slider to the left, and you can also control the midpoint slider to fine tune that. Local adjustments, masking. This is perhaps where DxO PhotoLabs differs mostly from Lightroom. And so we will basically have to learn new workflows in order to fast track the localized editing. First thing I do is I don't want to use those like 6 main areas. I want to be able to access them all from just below the basic tools or in their own panel above the basic tools. So I'm going to create a new palette. I've gone into the menu palettes, new palette, and this will give me the option to create a name, which will be local adjustments. And I'm going to add that in below the histogram and above the basic tools. Now I've got a new palette, but I need to then load that up with some of the features that I want to access quickly. So you'll see I've dropped in local exposure, local HSL, local mask options. That local mask options really is a compulsory one because you've got your chroma and luma sliders there. Local selective tone, local white balance. Linear gradients in Adobe are called graduated filters in DxO PhotoLab. So again, you'll probably get used to the name change there quite quickly. Now, graduated filters is something that I do a lot of the time. It is not uncommon for a sky to appear one stop brighter than we remember when we were actually capturing our landscape image. So some people, some landscape photographers even dark that with a graduated filter in front of the lens. But most people will be doing this in post-production. It works in a very similar way to Lightroom in that we just click, that's the third one in the row there, and then we can drag into our click and drag in our image to apply that graduated filter. Now just remember, if you click on that little question mark just in the lower right side of your panels there, you can get information, and that information will include some keyboard shortcuts that will give you more functionality over the graduated filters that you're creating. Now, if you hold down the Shift key in the Adobe Lightroom software, that will constrain it to a perfect horizontal or a perfect vertical. In this one, you will have to make sure that it is straight, and if it is a little bit crooked, just go to that little white dot at the lower edge of that graduated filter. This allows you to swing the graduated filter just to straighten it if it is a little bit crooked. I'm lowering the exposure of that sky. I'm also adding a second adjustment, which is just increasing the saturation in that sky. So we get some of the nice warm colors in those clouds showing up. And this is why I've gone for saturation instead of vibrancy. I'm just clicking and dragging. In this instance, I didn't need to go up to the local adjustments panel and click on the plus in order to access a new. So long as I drag sufficiently far away from that first one, I'll be able to add a second graduated filter, and I'm just darkening the lower edge of that frame, also winding that back one EV or one stop. Radial gradients in Adobe is a little bit different from the DxO control points, but this is the closest we can get. Now, they will prioritize the tones or colors just directly below the pin or point of DxO, but if you drag the chroma and luma sliders and set them to 0, then you can get the feature behaving in a very similar way to Lightroom. So I'll just demonstrate this just with this ellipse of 3 distinct tones here to show how DxO PhotoLabs targets the tone or color that is sitting underneath the pin or control point. So I've put that over the lighter of those 3 ovals there. Now you can see in the tool strip at the bottom it says color overlay. Now I'm going to just switch that to black and white so you can see how this control point is targeting the white or lighter tones more than the mid-tones or shadow tones there. Now the panel that will help you decrease the targeting or increase the targeting is the mask options, and you're looking at chroma and luma sliders there. So if I drag the chroma and luma sliders all the way to the left, then this radial filter is behaving much more like the Lightroom version there. It's not really targeting anything, it's basically just working inside of that main circle and then fading out as it moves beyond that circle. Now here I am, I'm dragging Luma, the Luma slider, all of the way up to the right, 100. So now it's only targeting those lighter tones. But you can also see that it's receptive to the positioning of this circle as well. So we're getting less adjustments outside of the circle than inside the circle. In Lightroom, we have like two circles, an inner and an outer, where it's working all at 100% maximum on the inner circle and then fading out to the edges. But you can see the single circle here is the middle of the transition between full adjustment and no adjustment. Now I'm moving that control point to one side to show you how it then prioritizes left side of this ellipse and having less impact on the right side of that ellipse. If I move it all the way to a different tone, you'll see automatically the control point targets just that tone, and again it's localized to the circle itself. So in a real world scenario, here I am trying to target the sky in this particular image to then bring down the exposure by a stop or so. So again, I'm playing with the chroma and luma sliders so that the adjustment is only going to impact that sky. Again, you can use the black and white mask just to make sure that you've got your targeting right. So you're very much balancing the chroma and luma sliders if you want to use that targeted adjustment. Here I'm trying to create an elliptical adjustment. Now in a Lightroom we can just change the shape of that circle to an ellipse, but this is something that we can't do in DxO PhotoLabs. But you can create a sort of an ellipse by just clicking to the right and then adding another control point which is linked to the first control point. If you wanted that second circle or control to have its own adjustment parameters, then you'd have to go to the local adjustments panel, click on the plus, and then click in the image. And so you'd have separate controls over each of those circles. But if you click to the right without doing that, you'll have basically creating an elongated circle or an ellipse. Here I am now with dropping the exposure. Remember I had the luma slider cranked all the way up to 100. So that soft edge, that edge of transition between the inner light tone and the middle mid-tone, we'll see that there's a white edge, and this can happen if you've got those luma sliders or hue sliders cranked up too far to the right. You basically want to lower that back off so more of those transition tones are brought into that, because if you're too aggressive with this adjustment, you will see the edge alongside the unadjusted areas and the adjusted areas. Here I'm lowering that chroma and luma sliders, and so we can't see a distinct edge between the highlight tones, which are being brought down 2 stops, and the mid-tones, which they're sitting next to. Remember, if you're wanting to create a new mask and you've got an active mask already there, just remember just to click on that plus icon, and this will ensure that you create a new control point rather adding subsidiary points to the initial control point. And if you want to make sure that you don't have an active mask when you're clicking along your choices of different mask options, then just click in away from your existing control points or localized adjustment points to deactivate the active mask. So let's go and take a look again in a real world scenario. Here I want to draw the viewer's attention to the small branches coming out of the sand. This is in Death Valley. So I'm clicking on new mask. I'm adding a control point to the left side of those branches there, and I'm dragging the chroma and luma sliders down to 0 because I don't want to target just the sand or just the branches. I just want a pool of additional light falling out over those areas. So I'll click to add a second area just to the right of the initial point. So remember, both of these are linked now to that one control point. And then I'll just go to the exposure and raise that by 1 stop. And again, this helps draw the viewer's attention to what I believe is the focal point of the image. If I want to retain some of the deeper shadows of the sand dunes behind, then I can also just drag the shadow slider to the left. Now here I'm using DxO PhotoLab's compare feature, and I'm comparing a completely unedited image with the final black and white conversion I've done here. I don't always have to have the completely unedited version on the left. I can cherry pick the version or a different image to compare the edited image on the right to. Creative Vignette without film pack installed. It's probably worth going over this one more time for those people trying to avoid that additional purchase. So here I am just going in, clicking in the middle of this image, and you'll see that we haven't really targeted, or we haven't detargeted the tones that we're sitting that pin over. It's really going for the tones that are close to that pin. So in order to remove that localized target area to specific colors or specific tones, I'm going to lower the chroma and luma sliders to 0, and then we're going to invert the mask. I'm going to move one of those control points to the left and then click to the right, just so I get an ellipse. Because I only want to really darken the corners a bit more like what Lightroom is doing when you're adding a vignette. You're not just doing an actual circle, it's working with the edges. So, and then I'm just lowering the exposure by almost a stop to do some creative vignetting. As I said, it is a little bit easier with the film pack, but it is not essential that you buy the film pack if you just want the creative vignetting. Remember, with the film pack, you also get luminosity masks as well, which is grayed out until that purchase has been made. If I wanted to copy this vignette, creative vignetting, I could copy that with just by going and selecting just the local adjustments. Remember, you'll be going to the image menu, copy, correction settings, and then you can select another image in your organizer and choose to paste those correction settings to add a vignette to additional images. Let's take a look at hue mask now. So we've replaced those 3 tones just with 3 different colors now, and this one doesn't require that you buy the film pack, so you can play and target specific colors. So I'm just targeting the color in the middle there, and as you can see, we can't see the other colors because it's effectively just targeted that. It's not restricted to a locality now, so we don't have that outer circle showing me that it's working within the parameters of just a region. It's basically gone everywhere in the image looking for that color in order to work and adjust that color. And if I move that control point to a different color, then you'll see that it just selects that color only. Now in this instance, if we want to lower the saturation of those blues, then I'll just go to the HSL panel and drag the saturation slider down to -100. People with eagle eyes will just see that there's a slight blue edge to where I have desaturated that blue ellipse. The transition between that grey tone now and the magenta tone, there's a hint of blue there. So what we can do, and as I've zoomed in, it's much more noticeable now. So what we can do in order to target those residual blues there is we can go into that color ramp there and just stretch out the color ramp to include more of those blues as it moves towards the magentas. Particularly the right side in this instance will be the important one, because then it can target those additional colors which are the transition colors between blue and magenta. So here I am with that black and white conversion now. You'll see that we can actually use that hue target even if we've already converted the image to black and white. DxO PhotoLabs is aware of the color underneath that underlying black and white conversion. So again, I could alternatively, I did this with a straight control point now, but we're going to work out whether we can do that with the hue mask instead. Now if I do it with the hue mask, it's quite a simple task for it to target the blue sky. But you'll also notice that it targets some blues in the man's suit in the middle of the image, and also in some of the cool shadow tones of that tree being cast there. So this is a good candidate for the hue mask. I just find that the greens behind this lemur is just a little bit too saturated and a little bit distracting. So I'm going to use the hue mask to target those colors. And you see with the color overlay active, we can see that it's targeted those quite well. Now we can expand that range with that hue ramp in the mask options there. Now if I go too far to the left on the hue ramp and it starts selecting some of the oranges, then it's going to start including the eyes in the mask. So that's we'll be just working with the right side of the ramp, some of the aqua tones leaning towards blues, but leave that left side of the ramp away from the oranges there. limit the oranges to protect the eyes, and again I'm successfully desaturating the greens in the background here. So luminosity masks requires DxO Film Pack, which is an additional $139 US price tag there. Some people will want just the ease of editing and not have anything grayed out in their software. Others will just choose the workarounds that I've been using here. Creative black and white, if you are doing a black and white, we'll just go and revisit that image and just show you a little bit more how I got there. Is the first thing in the basic tools, the color black and white rendering, which is where you can also pick up your profile, is we can choose that black and white there. And I'm choosing rendering DxO black and white strong. That's a strong contrast there. Now you also have, just like we have in Lightroom, is if we go to our channel mixer, we can darken or lighten colors based on their color. So I'm lowering the blues just to darken the sky above these sand dunes here. So that channel mixer really goes hand in hand with the color and black and white rendering there, which we may be wanting to use there to just set an initial starting point for how much contrast we want. For lovers of huge amount of contrast and detail, you might want to use the equivalent to the Dehaze feature in Lightroom, which is DxO Clear View Plus. I think this is a little bit strong for me, but it does give you that immediate effect without doing loads and loads of adjustments. So if you do want a really heavy effect, and you can always ramp that back, you don't have to go in with intensity 50, you could just be a little bit more subtle about this. So again, I'm using that compare view. This time I'm selecting one of the virtual copies. That is a feature that is also shared with Lightroom. So I'm picking up one of those virtual copies of an unedited or one without that feature applied that we've just been looking at, Clear View Plus. And I'm now comparing it to before and after Clear View Plus has been applied. Now I'm going to choose to edit and get quite a dramatic feel without using Clear View Plus, which I think is perhaps just a little bit strong for me. So I'm just going in and showing you how I can edit using localized adjustments primarily. So here I'm using control lines instead of the control point. I'm using a control line, and again it does what the control points do, is it will target the tone and color underneath that point. So here I'm just trying to work on the shadows of the sand dunes. So I've dragged up a control line from the image, and then I can subtract the sky from that area. So I've targeted the sand dunes or the shadows on the sand dunes really quite well. So if I did want to just apply Clear View Plus just to those shadow tones, you can see now that opens up, or I could just alternatively apply more detail or more contrast. So here I am with control points this time, and I've got two controls linked to the same point there because I want to just target the highlights on these now, and I can bring the exposure down by 1 1/3 stops, so we've got rich detail of the structure of these sand dunes that are visible now. And I'm going to finish that up with a little bit of unsharp mask and also lens softness compensation. I really want some fine detail on these sand dunes here. And remember, some of these adjustments are only visible at magnifications 75% and greater. So I'll reach for the loop tool and just drag that over the image. And you can see we've got some really nice detail of some of the sand blowing off the edge of that sand dune in Western Australia here. Luminosity mask, purchase of DxO Film Pack required. Remember, I'll just show this slide we looked at previously, and that is if you haven't really been using the luminance masks in Lightroom, you're not going to really miss them in DxO PhotoLab either. We can do enough with control points, I think, and also control lines, often without having to have this luminosity mask feature as well. But here I'm demonstrating that we can either just click on one of 10 zones or tones in there, or we can go in and click inside of the image, and then we've got a tonal ramp there. We can broaden or narrow if we're just trying to target specific tones there. Now I'm going in with some micro contrast, which is the equivalent of clarity inside of Lightroom. So if I was clicking on the sky and I'm not too sure whether I want to broaden that, I can just start playing around and clicking one of those 10 zones or tones. They look very much like Ansel Adams' zone system to me as we look over those areas. And so I can target specific areas to darken or lighten based on their tonal value. And just remember, on a black and white conversion, it is always important to have a black and white point in most black and white conversions. And so I'm going into the tone curve and just dragging in that triangle on the right side of that tone curve until I've got a white point. And again, if you're not too sure whether you're clipping some of those highlight tones, just click on the sun just below the histogram so we can show highlight clipping there. This time I'm using compare view with a split view, so I can drag that line backwards and forwards to see where we've come from and where we've got to. Whenever you're finished editing an image, you most likely want to export an image, so for sharing on social media, or just so that we can see the sharpness when we go into full screen views, if we've been using Lens Softness Compensation, or we want to see a clean, crisp image without the noise, using DxO's excellent denoising technologies there. So you will go into that little browser area, or you go to the main menus if that's easier, just to pick up that export button there, and then go to export. Now I will often just want to export it as another raw file, a DNG file. And I can basically put a suffix saying _DxO to basically let me know or remind me when I'm looking at the browser that this one has been edited by DxO, and I've exported it just so I can see the denoising technologies and the lens softness compensations applied. So this one is all corrections being applied and being exported. And now when I click, I don't have to zoom in to any particular zoom level. I can actually see the processed version is clean and sharp compared to the original version, which still has the evidence of the noise. And I'm also allowed to view this in full screen, i.e. magnifications lower than 75%, and get a great view of the processed image. So here I am exporting again. Now this image was in a project folder, and when I export the exported image won't appear in the project folder with the original image. I'd perhaps like DxO maybe to give us these options, but at the moment, so I'm exporting very noisy image you see here. This is a 12,800 ISO, I believe, and it's a heavily cropped image. So we're looking at cannonball sized grain there. So I'm exporting. When the exported file is finished, I'll go into my project folder and I'll right click and I'll choose reveal image folder, because the processed image will go alongside the original image in the original image folder, and then I can add that to the project folder. So here I am right clicking on the processed version and choosing add to project, because I do want this process file in the project folder. And I'll just do a side-by-side comparison, and if I haven't really shown you how great the denoising and the sharpening features inside of DxO, this again is something to marvel at, because most people would discard the image on the left and be perfectly happy with the image on the right. Let's take a look in depth at those denoising technologies, which is a real hero. Remember, we're currently using the Deep Prime XD/XD2S algorithms, and these are as good as they've been so far. And at the moment, as I said, they seem to be working better for me than the denoising features inside of Lightroom. Just bringing up the image properties panel now. You basically press the I key inside of Lightroom to bring up the information, but here I'm bringing up the image properties panel inside of DxO PhotoLab just so I can see all of the information, i.e. what camera, what lens, and everything else about this image. So I'm coming in, and again I've cropped quite heavily on an image with very high ISO, just bringing in that loop, and again you can marvel at what such a noisy image this was at 12,800 and heavily cropped to being a really good image of this kookaburra in a rainforest here. So I'm exporting the image here, and this time I'm exporting it for sharing on social media. So what I've done, I've set my parameters: export as JPEG, 90 quality, and the size. I'm going to export this with the short size at 2160, so it's good for 4K viewing. And I'm going to create a new option so I don't have to continually put in these settings manually. I've basically saved all of these settings as an output option. So output settings 1, which you see highlighted there, is my own saved setting there. And as you can see, there it is being exported with those settings with a new saved setting. And as we then view that inside of DxO PhotoLab, the process version, and again I can be viewing this at magnification values lower than 75%, and you'll see all of that sharpening and denoising beautifully applied and baked into this new file there. Now, if you're not quite ready for PhotoLab yet, so you're probably wanting to soldier on with the Lightroom, but you are sold on the Denoising Technologies and also the Lens Softness Compensation, which in my opinion is equally as fabulous, then you can just buy the DxO Pure Raw. Now this will be a little bit of a purchase that is replicated if you do DxO PhotoLab, because this will be included in PhotoLab. So you have to be pretty sure that you don't want those features in PhotoLab if you're just going for Pure Raw. Now here I am in Adobe. Now this image looks quite dark because I've lowered the camera exposure so I don't blow out the highlights in the bokeh in the background. So I've purposely lowered the exposure. This also creates a bit of a problem for noise when you add the increased exposure, protecting the highlights in post-production editing. So here I've increased the exposure 2 stops to restore the shadows, but I've brought the highlights down and protected those highlights so they don't clip. When I export it to DxO Pure Raw, I don't see that exposure adjustment. It basically comes in without any of the adjustments. And this is a little bit of a different behavior. If you're exporting an image to DxO PhotoLab, this wouldn't be the case. But here I'm having to decide the amount of noise reduction and sharpening on quite a dark image. And then I'm basically saying to DxO Pure Raw is where do you want this image to go and how do you want it to be named once processed. So I'm saying put it inside a collection underscore high ISO raw, and I know where this image will end up when it comes back into the Lightroom catalog, and it'll automatically appear inside of that collection for me. I can find that in that collection, and then I can go to folder in library. And in order to restore the corrected view, because I've corrected it once on the unprocessed file, now I'm going to copy all of those settings from the edited file inside Lightroom and then post them to the file that has had Denoising Technologies and then Softness Compensation applied in DxO. So I'm going to be copying all of the settings except for the sharpening and the lens corrections, because this will have been done in the Pure Raw software. And there's the edited file, clean as a whistle, really fine detail in the feather structure, and again really happy with these technologies. And it was these technologies which really drew me to DxO in the first place. Concluding statements is, I think personally from experiences, I think the PhotoLab 8 is possibly the best alternative to Lightroom. Is it better than Lightroom? One would have to say that depends on the user. I am a little bit married and a fan of the AI masking, like select background, select subject, select sky, and I expect those to arrive in DxO PhotoLab, but they're not there yet. So in some workflows, I can edit as quickly in DxO PhotoLab as I can in Lightroom, but in some occasions it can be a little bit slower. One of the other reservations for me is why I will possibly use Lightroom and DxO PhotoLab for possibly a while to come, is because I am using pre-production and new release cameras, and there's a little bit more of a wait in DxO PhotoLab before we can access those files. So I'll be using Sony's Imaging Edge software, which is the fastest to be able to open those files. Then Lightroom comes in quite quickly, and then DxO PhotoLab will follow that, because they do make a lot more profiles, and that is one of the reasons that we're just a little bit slower in being able to open files in DxO PhotoLab. Hopefully you've enjoyed this tutorial. Hopefully I made that a pain-free approach. If you do want to get to grips with this and you want to ask more questions about PhotoLab, then just be sure to head over to my patreon.com/Mark Gaylor. You'll see my support channel, and I will be making lots of the raw files I've been using in this presentation. I will make them available to my patrons to download, and I'll probably make other workshops, editing workshops using DxO PhotoLab, because I've got many workshops using Lightroom to highlight my workflows using that software. Okay, give me the thumbs up if you've enjoyed this, and I'll catch you online next time.